They called it the expulsion sanction, and the word they reached for when they wrote it was expelled. Not exiled. Not removed. Expelled, the word you use for something that does not belong, something the body has identified as foreign and decided to push out. I read it 11 times the week it passed. I was 32 years old, working a trade licensing desk on the Keltar frontier, and when the dispatch came through I read it 11 times because I wanted to make sure I understood what the Orethaan Sovereign Assembly had just decided about us. I understood it. I just didn't believe it would matter. Tonight I am 54, and I am sitting in the observer gallery of the Assembly's full session chamber at Orethaan Station, and the 7 house tables below me are filling with Orethaan delegates in their formal house colours, and what I am watching is a body that has extended the expulsion sanctions enforcement window 22 consecutive times without once pulling the trigger. 22 sessions. 22 votes to delay. And now, by the terms of Article 44 itself, they have 1 session left. Vote tonight to extend, or the Sanctions Enforcement Authority expires at midnight by the Charter's own language. They scheduled this session 3 months ago and listed it as a formality. I was asked to attend as Earth's final observer. I accepted. The chamber at Orethaan is older than the Assembly's current membership. Stone-laid walls, 6,000 years of deliberative history pressed into the mortar, and above it a dome of polished transit glass that looks out onto the approach corridor. Through it, if you know to look, you can see the running lights of vessels in holding pattern. Tonight there are quite a few of them. The chair of the first house called the session to order. His name is Calvareth, and he is the 3rd Calvareth to hold that chair. The original one signed the expulsion sanction. I find that worth noting. He read the session's purpose into the record. Extension vote on Article 44, Enforcement Docket 12. The motion required a 5-house majority. 6 of the 7 houses had voted to extend every previous session. The math had always been simple. He was not hurrying. The 2nd house seconded the motion. Routine. The 3rd house registered its support. Also routine. Then the 4th house's senior delegate, a woman named Orethaan, who had held her seat for 9 years and had voted to extend 4 times without comment, asked to address the chamber before the vote was called. Calvareth allowed it. Orethaan stood and said that the 4th house had reviewed the corridor claims registered under human registry over the preceding 22 years. She said the figure was substantial. She said the 4th house would not be voting to extend. The chamber went quiet in the way that large rooms go quiet when the math changes unexpectedly. Calvareth asked her to confirm. She confirmed it. The 6th house, after a pause of roughly 4 seconds, announced the same position. That was 2 houses. 5 votes were required to extend. 5 votes remained on the table. 5 votes minus 2 left them at the threshold with no margin, and the 5th house had been making quiet noises for 3 sessions about what an unexecuted expulsion sanction says to the rest of the corridor about Assembly authority. I had read those noises carefully. I had not engineered them, but I had read them. The 5th house abstained. Calvareth called for a procedural hold. He asked the Assembly's charter clerk, an elderly Orethaan woman who had been at that desk for longer than I had been alive, whether a hold was permissible under the circumstances. The clerk said it was not. The motion required resolution within the session. The session's clock was running. The charter was explicit. I watched Calvareth's secondary eyelids. The Orethaan have 3 sets, the innermost of which closes involuntarily under what I had come to think of as the sensation of a floor disappearing, and both of them dropped, held, and then pulled back. He turned to the 1st house's delegation and conferred in a register too low for the gallery to hear. Then he turned back to the floor. He asked whether there was a mechanism to amend the motion. The clerk said that under Docket 12 the motion was unamendable at the final session. This was language the Assembly itself had written into Article 44 when they passed it. The final extension window was not subject to amendment because the Charter's authors had wanted the Enforcement Authority question resolved, not deferred again. I had known this for 14 years. I had read Article 44's subsidiary clauses a great many times. Calvareth asked about challenge mechanisms. The clerk listed them. 3 were available. 2 required quorum votes that would not resolve before midnight. 1 required the agreement of the body being sanctioned, which was humanity, and I was the only human in the chamber. He looked up at the observer gallery. I looked back at him.
Ibaita a moment.
Then I opened the document I had brought and read the relevant clause aloud, quietly, into the chamber's acoustic reach. Article 44, subsection 11, paragraph 4. Enforcement authority not exercised within the final session lapses without remedy and may not be reconstituted by subsequent motion. I folded my hands on the railing and did not say anything further. The chamber had a quality then that I have tried to describe to people who were not there and have never managed to do adequately. It was not silence, exactly. The ventilation ran. Someone's chair shifted. But the deliberative noise, the murmur of consultation, the low register of House delegates conferring, that stopped completely. What replaced it was something closer to the sound of a very large number of people recognizing, at the same moment, that the room they were in was not the room they had thought they were in when they walked through the door. Calvareth asked the First House's legal attaché a question I couldn't hear. The attaché answered it. Calvareth closed his secondary eyelids again, longer this time. The Third House's delegate raised her hand and asked, in a voice that had the careful flatness of someone trying not to let the pitch rise, whether the corridor claims registered under human registry during the 22-year enforcement window would be subject to renegotiation once the sanction expired. The clerk said the expiration of enforcement authority had no retroactive effect on registrations completed under existing corridor law during the active window. The claims would stand. They would be permanent under corridor law. Renegotiation would require separate action under a different article. The Third House delegate sat down. The Seventh House, which had said nothing all session, asked through its chair how many registered human vessels were in the corridor approach at this moment. I don't know why they asked it in that room. Perhaps they had been looking through the dome and had already counted. The session's traffic clerk reported the number. 340 vessels. Registered, flagged, operating under human registry within what had been, until tonight, a contested corridor designation. After tonight, it would not be contested. The corridor claims would be permanent. The vessels would be lawful. The designation would convert to settled human territory under the same corridor law the Assembly had written. No one in that chamber had sent those vessels tonight. They had been arriving for 22 years, one registered claim at a time, each one logged and legal, each one another metre of corridor with a human registry stamp on it. What was visible through the dome was not a fleet deployed as a threat. It was paperwork made visible. It was what 22 years of procedural extension looks like from the outside. The Sixth House's delegate, who had voted against extension tonight and therefore contributed to this moment, said quietly and to no one in particular that she had not understood the registration numbers. I did not respond to this. It was not said to me. I noted it. The clock ran. There was a period, perhaps 20 minutes, in which Calvareth conferred with the legal attaché and the charter clerk and two delegates from the houses that had held extension votes, working through mechanisms the way you work through a locked room when you have already tried the door and the windows. The clerk answered each question the same way. The clause was explicit, the charter was clear, the authors had written it this way deliberately. At midnight, the authority lapsed. There was no remedy. At 11 minutes to midnight, the First House moved that the session enter closed deliberation. The clerk noted that closed deliberation had no effect on the charter's clock. The First House withdrew the motion. At 4 minutes to midnight, Calvareth looked up at the observer gallery again. I do not know what he was looking for. I was sitting in the same position I had occupied since the session began. I had not raised my voice. I had not argued. I had read one clause and folded my hands and let the charter that the Assembly had written 22 years ago do what the Assembly had written it to do. At midnight, the clerk announced the expiration of the enforcement window under Article 44, Docket 12. She entered it into the record. Her voice was the same voice she had used for every other procedural notation in the session. It was the same voice she had used for 22 years of those notations, I expect. Calvareth called for recess. The 7 house tables began to empty. Delegates conferred in low voices and moved toward the chamber exits. The clerk filed the session record. The ventilation continued to run. Through the dome, 340 sets of running lights held their positions in the corridor that was now, by the Assembly's own charter, settled human territory. I stayed in the gallery until the last delegate had gone. I have been asked since that night whether I felt satisfaction. Whether the long wait, 22 years of sessions I did not attend, 14 years of reading the charter subsections, 2 years of reading the Fourth House's corridor claim reviews, resolved into something that felt like a win. The honest answer is that it felt like watching a clock run out. That is all it was, in the end. The Orethaan Sovereign Assembly wrote a sanction and wrote an enforcement window and wrote a final session clause and wrote an expiration provision. And then they deliberated for 22 years, and the clock ran. We registered corridor claims the whole time because corridor law permitted it. We built what we built because no one stopped us. They had the authority to stop us. They extended it 22 times. Then they could not extend it a 23rd time, and the authority lapsed, and what was visible through the dome was what you get when you give a species 22 years to work. They called it the expulsion sanction. The word they forgot to use was enforce,